What if the most dangerous secret in America didn't die with a president, but with the journalist determined to expose it? 5 days before revealing what she called the scoop of the century, Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead under circumstances so strange that nothing seemed to fit. The room was wrong, the evidence was gone, and 60 years later, the questions remain. The woman who couldn't be ignored. To understand why Dorothy Kilgallen's death still fascinates people 60 years later, you first have to understand who she was. Because Dorothy wasn't an obscure reporter chasing rumors from the margins. She was one of the most powerful journalists in America. Long before her name became connected to the Kennedy assassination, she had built a career that few reporters could match. By her 20s, she was already making headlines traveling around the world, covering major criminal trials and transforming herself into a national celebrity. Millions read her newspaper column every day. Millions more watched her on television. But fame wasn't what made Dorothy dangerous. It was her ability to notice what others overlooked. Throughout her career, she challenged official narratives, exposed weaknesses in major criminal cases, and asked questions that many reporters avoided. She understood that the truth rarely announces itself. More often, it hides inside contradictions, omissions, and uncomfortable details. And time after time, her instincts proved correct. By the early 1960s, Dorothy stood at the height of her influence. Politicians, celebrities, judges, and law enforcement officials all knew her name. She had access that most journalists could only dream of. Then, on November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. For America, it was a national tragedy. For Dorothy Kilgallen, it became something else. A mystery she could not ignore. And before long, that mystery would consume the final years of her life. 2 assassinations in 3 days. For most Americans, the assassination of President Kennedy was a national tragedy. For Dorothy Kilgallen, it was the beginning of a mystery. As the nation watched the chaos unfold from Dallas, millions struggled to make sense of the horror. A young president was gone. A grieving widow stood beside his coffin. And an entire country searched desperately for answers. Then 2 days later, something happened that changed everything. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of killing President Kennedy, was shot dead on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. America froze. One assassination was shocking enough. 2 in 3 days felt almost impossible. To many, it looked like justice arriving swiftly. To Dorothy, it looked like a door slamming shut. The moment Ruby pulled the trigger, the only suspect in the murder of a president was silenced forever. And that bothered her deeply. Because Dorothy had spent her entire career studying how truth behaves under pressure. She understood that facts rarely disappear on their own. They are buried, redirected, protected. Sometimes by fear, sometimes by power. The official explanations came quickly, perhaps too quickly. Authorities assured the public that Oswald acted alone. The case, they implied, was already moving toward resolution. But Dorothy wasn't convinced. Not because she had evidence of a conspiracy, not yet, but because she recognized something familiar in the atmosphere surrounding the investigation, a subtle tension between what was being said and what was being avoided. Questions seemed to vanish before they could be asked. Witnesses were dismissed. Timelines shifted. Contradictions were treated like inconveniences rather than clues. And for a reporter whose instincts had been sharpened by decades inside courtrooms and political scandals, those details mattered. So while much of America began accepting the official narrative, Dorothy began building something else. A private investigation. A growing collection of notes, interviews, leaked documents, and unanswered questions that she kept close to her at all times. What started as professional curiosity slowly became an obsession. Friends noticed it. Sources noticed it. Even federal authorities appeared to notice it. Because Dorothy wasn't simply reviewing evidence. She was following threads. And every thread seemed to lead somewhere powerful people preferred not to look. The deeper she went, the more convinced she became that the Kennedy assassination was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. And somewhere behind the headlines, behind the commissions, behind the carefully crafted public statements, a larger truth was waiting to be uncovered. The question was no longer whether Dorothy Kilgallen would find it. The question was whether someone would stop her first. The leak that shook Washington. As Dorothy dug deeper into the Kennedy assassination, she gained access to something few reporters would ever see. Secret testimony from inside the Warren Commission. Not rumors, not speculation, official documents. And instead of keeping them hidden, she published them. The leak sent shockwaves through Washington. But what truly caught Dorothy's attention wasn't the classified material itself. It was Jack Ruby's words. The man who had killed Lee Harvey Oswald told Chief Justice Earl Warren that his life was in danger. He insisted there were things he wanted to reveal, but could not safely discuss in Dallas. Again and again, Ruby hinted at a larger story, a larger threat. Then the questioning ended. No major follow-up, no urgent investigation, no attempt to discover why one of the most important witnesses in America appeared terrified to speak openly. For Dorothy, that silence was impossible to ignore. Because sometimes the most revealing part of a story isn't what someone says, it's what everyone else refuses to ask. As federal authorities launched an effort to identify the source behind the leak, Dorothy became even more convinced she was onto something significant. If the testimony meant nothing, why was Washington so concerned about how she obtained it? The deeper she looked, the more she believed the official story contained gaps too large to dismiss. And somewhere inside those gaps, she suspected the truth was waiting. What she didn't know was that her most important breakthrough was still ahead. A private meeting, a closed door, and a conversation with Jack Ruby that no one else would ever hear. 8 minutes that changed everything. For most reporters covering the Jack Ruby trial, access was everything. A quote, a photograph, a brief exchange across a crowded courtroom. For Dorothy Kilgallen, that wasn't enough. She wanted answers. And somehow she obtained something no other journalist would ever receive. Time alone with Jack Ruby. Not a press conference, not a supervised interview, a private conversation behind a closed door. Just Dorothy and the man who had killed Lee Harvey Oswald. The opportunity came during Ruby's 1964 murder trial in Dallas. With the approval of his attorney and courtroom officials, Dorothy was escorted into a small office near the courtroom. Then everyone else left. The door closed. For somewhere between 8 and 30 minutes, depending on differing accounts, no one knows exactly what was said inside that room. No recordings were made. No transcript exists. No witnesses were present. And that is precisely what makes the moment so haunting. Because when Dorothy emerged, something had changed. Friends noticed it. Sources noticed it. Even fellow journalists sensed it. She spoke less publicly about what she knew and worked more intensely behind the scenes. It was as if the interview had transformed a collection of suspicions into something far more concrete. something she wasn't yet ready to reveal. Years later, researchers would obsess over a simple question. What did Jack Ruby tell her? The truth is, nobody knows. Dorothy never published the contents of that conversation. She never discussed it in detail. She never left behind a public explanation. But her actions afterward tell a story of their own. She began carrying a locked file wherever she went. The file grew thicker. Her investigation expanded. New sources appeared. New leads emerged. And according to people close to her, Dorothy became convinced she was approaching something enormous. Not merely a flaw in the official investigation. A hidden narrative. A structure beneath the surface. A version of events that connected people, places, and motives in ways the public had never been allowed to see. The stakes were rising, and Dorothy knew it. By now, federal agencies were already interested in her activities. Her leaked Warren Commission stories had attracted unwanted attention. Powerful institutions were aware that one of America's most influential journalists was digging where she wasn't supposed to dig. Yet she kept going. Perhaps because she believed truth was worth the risk. Or perhaps because she had already crossed a point of no return. There is a strange pattern that appears throughout history. People spend years searching for answers. Then one day they find a piece of the puzzle they were never meant to see. And from that moment forward, everything changes. For Dorothy Kilgallen, that moment may have happened inside a small room in Dallas with Jack Ruby. Because after that conversation, she was no longer simply investigating the Kennedy assassination. She was building a case. And somewhere within that growing mountain of notes, interviews, and secrets, she believed she had found the thread that could unravel the entire story. What she didn't know was that the closer she came to the truth, the closer she may have been moving toward her own final chapter. Following the threads. After her meeting with Jack, Dorothy Kilgallen's investigation took on a new urgency. The questions she had once treated as loose ends were beginning to connect. She focused on witnesses whose accounts contradicted the official narrative, people who claimed they saw things that didn't fit the story Americans were being told. One witness described seeing two men near the scene of Officer J.D. Tippett's murder, not one. Others spoke of conversations, meetings, and connections that never seemed to appear in official reports. Individually, none of these details proved a conspiracy. But together they painted a picture that Dorothy found increasingly difficult to ignore. The deeper she dug, the more she became convinced that important pieces of the Kennedy story had been left out. Not necessarily erased, simply left unexplained. What made Dorothy different from countless amateur investigators was her access. She wasn't working from rumors or second-hand theories. She was speaking directly to witnesses, cultivating sources, and comparing their accounts against official records. And those records often raised as many questions as they answered. Friends began noticing a change in her. She became more guarded, more careful about what she discussed and with whom. At least once, she reportedly admitted that the information she was uncovering could be dangerous. Not professionally, personally. Yet she refused to stop. Because after nearly 2 years of investigation, Dorothy believed she was approaching something important. Something hidden beneath the headlines. Something powerful enough to explain why so many questions surrounding Dallas refused to go away. And as 1965 drew to a close, she began telling friends that a major breakthrough was finally within reach. What she didn't know was that she was entering the final week of her life. The last 5 days. History often remembers the moment a person dies. What it rarely remembers is the silence that comes just before. The final phone calls, the unfinished notes, the plans that were never meant to end. By the autumn of 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen was living inside that silence without realizing it. For nearly 2 years, she had followed the Kennedy assassination deeper than almost any journalist in America. The investigation had consumed her thoughts, filled her notebooks, and transformed a celebrated columnist into something else entirely, a woman pursuing answers that seemed to exist just beyond reach. But now, according to those closest to her, something had changed. The uncertainty was fading. Confidence was replacing it. Friends later recalled that Dorothy seemed energized, almost exhilarated. The pieces she had spent months gathering were finally beginning to fit together. The witnesses, the leaked testimony, the private conversation with Jack Ruby, the mysterious contacts she refused to identify. For the first time, she appeared convinced she knew where the story was leading, and she wasn't keeping that confidence entirely to herself. Several people would later remember hearing variations of the same remarkable claim. She was close, very close. One friend recalled Dorothy saying she was about to reveal the biggest scoop of the century. Another remembered an even more chilling statement. In 5 more days, she reportedly said, "I'm going to break this case wide open." 5 days. It is impossible to know exactly what Dorothy believed she had uncovered. Perhaps she had found a witness. Perhaps a document. Perhaps a connection powerful enough to challenge the official narrative that had dominated public discussion since 1963. Whatever it was, she clearly believed it mattered. Enough to finish the book she was writing. Enough to protect her sources at all costs. Enough to continue despite years of pressure and scrutiny. Yet beneath that confidence lingered something darker. People around her noticed moments of caution, moments when the fearless reporter seemed aware that the ground beneath her was becoming increasingly dangerous. She reportedly told one confidant that what she had learned could get her killed if the wrong people discovered she knew it. At the time, it may have sounded dramatic. After all, Dorothy Kilgallen wasn't operating in some distant battlefield. She lived in Manhattan, appeared on television every week, attended glamorous parties, walked through a world of celebrities, politicians, and media executives. But history has a strange way of reminding us that danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an ordinary evening, an ordinary drink, an ordinary trip home. And on the night of November 7th, 1965, that's exactly how it seemed. Dorothy appeared on national television as she had countless times before. The audience laughed, the cameras rolled, the show ended. Nothing appeared unusual, nothing appeared wrong. But somewhere between the bright lights of the studio and the darkness of the early morning hours, the story she had spent 2 years chasing was about to collide with the story that would define her legacy forever. Because in less than 24 hours, Dorothy Kilgallen would be dead. And the mystery she had been trying to solve would suddenly have a second victim. The night everything went wrong. Sunday, November 7th, 1965 began like countless other evenings in Dorothy Kilgallen's extraordinary life. The lights of the CBS studio glowed brightly. Cameras rolled. Millions of viewers across America settled into their living rooms to watch another episode of What's My Line, the beloved television show that had made Dorothy a familiar face in households from New York to California. On screen, she appeared exactly as she always had. Sharp, confident, effortlessly composed. No one watching could have imagined they were seeing her for the last time. As the broadcast ended, Dorothy stepped away from the cameras and back into the life she had carefully balanced for years, a life divided between celebrity journalism and a private investigation that few people truly understood. By all accounts, she seemed upbeat that night. Friends later recalled no signs of distress, no fear, no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. If anything, she appeared energized, a woman standing on the edge of a breakthrough. After the show, Dorothy reportedly stopped for drinks, as she often did. New York's nightlife was familiar territory for someone who had spent decades moving comfortably through the worlds of media, politics, and entertainment. What happened next, however, remains one of the most frustrating gaps in the entire story. At some point after midnight, the timeline begins to blur. Witnesses would later place Dorothy at the Regency Hotel lounge, speaking with a man whose name would become deeply entwined with speculation surrounding her death. Others offered conflicting accounts. Hours passed. The city moved through another ordinary Manhattan night. Taxis crossed Park Avenue. Neon lights reflected from rain-darkened streets. People laughed in bars. Newspapers rolled off printing presses. And somewhere within those missing hours, the final chapter of Dorothy Kilgallen's life was being written. The most unsettling part isn't what we know, it's what we don't. No detailed police reconstruction was ever created. No exhaustive timeline was assembled. No serious effort was made to identify everyone she met during her final hours. For a woman investigating the most controversial murder in modern American history, that absence feels almost impossible to explain. The trail simply disappears. Then sometime before dawn, Dorothy returned to her townhouse on East 68th Street. She entered the home. The door closed behind her, and according to the official record, that is where the story ends. But decades later, many researchers would argue that the real mystery was only beginning. Because when morning arrived and Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead, the scene that awaited discovery would raise more questions than answers. Questions so strange, so specific, and so deeply unsettling, that 60 years later, people are still trying to understand what really happened inside that house before sunrise. Because the bedroom where Dorothy was found would reveal something investigators should never have ignored. Everything was wrong. Everything was wrong. The next morning, the mystery should have ended. Instead, it became even darker. When Dorothy Kilgallen's longtime hairdresser arrived at her Manhattan townhouse on November 8, 1965, he expected an ordinary appointment. He had known Dorothy for years. He understood her routines, her habits, the rhythm of her daily life. What he found was a scene that felt wrong from the very first glance. Dorothy was dead, but it wasn't simply the death that disturbed him. It was the details, the countless small details that refused to make sense. She was found in a third-floor bedroom, a room she hadn't slept in for years. After discovering her husband's affair, Dorothy had permanently moved her sleeping quarters to another floor and rarely entered the old bedroom except when necessary. Yet somehow, this was where her body was discovered. Then there was her appearance. She was still wearing the heavy television makeup from the previous night's broadcast. The false eyelashes remained in place. The cosmetics had never been removed. To an outsider, that might seem insignificant. To those who knew Dorothy, it was astonishing. She followed the same nightly routine without fail. No matter how late she returned home, she always removed her makeup before bed. Always. But that wasn't the strangest detail. A book rested on her lap. Investigators would later note that Dorothy had supposedly fallen asleep while reading. There was only one problem. According to people close to her, she had already finished that book weeks earlier. More troubling still, her reading glasses were nowhere to be found, and Dorothy could not comfortably read without them. Not a page, not a paragraph, not even a sentence. Then there were the 2 empty drinking glasses sitting nearby. 2 glasses. Yet, according to the official account, Dorothy had gone to bed alone. The contradictions kept multiplying. Wrong bedroom, wrong book, missing glasses, untouched makeup, 2 glasses instead of 1. Individually, each detail might have seemed trivial. Together, they painted a far more troubling picture. It was as though someone had attempted to create the appearance of a natural death without truly understanding the woman whose life they were trying to imitate. Like a stage set built by someone who knew the broad outlines of a character, but none of the intimate details. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all was this: where was the file? For nearly 2 years, Dorothy had carried her Kennedy investigation everywhere. Notes, witness statements, leads, contacts, the private fragments of a story she believed would shake the country. Friends knew about it. Sources knew about it. Dorothy guarded it obsessively. Now it was gone. Not misplaced. Not hidden. Gone. The investigation she had spent months building seemed to vanish at the exact moment she vanished. And yet, despite the extraordinary circumstances, despite the missing material, and the glaring inconsistencies, authorities showed little interest in asking why. Officially, the case was already moving toward a conclusion. But for those who looked closely at that room, one conclusion felt impossible to escape. Whatever happened during Dorothy Kilgallen's final hours, the scene left behind did not look like the end of a story. It looked like the beginning of another one. A death, a missing file, and a trail, gone cold. If the strange scene inside Dorothy Kilgallen's bedroom raised questions, what happened afterward raised even more. The official conclusion pointed toward an accidental overdose, a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. Yet even the medical findings stopped short of certainty, classifying her death under circumstances that could not be fully explained. For many, that should have been the beginning of a deeper investigation. Instead, it was nearly the end. As attention shifted toward the cause of death, something far more significant appeared to vanish. Dorothy's Kennedy files. For almost 2 years, she had collected witness statements, confidential sources, leaked testimony, and personal notes connected to the assassination investigation. Most importantly, the file reportedly contained the only known notes from her private conversation with Jack Ruby. Then almost overnight, it was gone. No archive ever recovered it. No official explanation was ever offered. The investigation Dorothy believed would become the biggest story of her career simply disappeared alongside her, and she wasn't the only one who took secrets to the grave. Before her death, Dorothy had reportedly shared portions of her manuscript with close friend Florence Pritchett Smith. One day after Dorothy died, Florence died as well. The manuscript was never found. Years later, Dorothy's husband, Richard Colmar, was repeatedly asked about the missing files. His answer rarely changed. "That secret will have to go to the grave with me." Eventually, it did. When Colmar died in 1971, whatever he knew vanished with him. One by one, witnesses disappeared. Memories faded. Potential suspects died. Crucial evidence was lost. And perhaps that became the most effective cover-up of all. Not secrecy. Time. Because time accomplishes what investigations sometimes cannot. It erases details, silences voices, turns unanswered questions into historical footnotes. Yet one fact survived. Dorothy Kilgallen spent the final years of her life convinced she was closing in on a truth powerful enough to change how Americans understood the Kennedy assassination. 5 days before she claimed she would expose it, she was dead. The files were gone. The witnesses were fading, and the questions were only beginning. The question that refuses to die. 60 years later, Dorothy Kilgallen's story remains suspended between history and mystery. The official record says she died from a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. The unanswered questions tell a different story. A journalist investigating the most controversial murder in modern American history dies just days before promising to reveal a major breakthrough. Her files disappear. Key witnesses fade away. Critical opportunities to investigate are missed. And the deeper researchers look, the more difficult it becomes to separate coincidence from possibility. Perhaps Dorothy uncovered something explosive. Perhaps she was simply following leads that would never have led to definitive proof. The truth is, we don't know. And that uncertainty may be the most important part of the story. Because Dorothy Kilgallen spent her entire career challenging easy answers, she understood that the truth is rarely neat, rarely convenient, and almost never arrives wrapped in certainty. What remains undeniable is this: she was one of the few journalists with the access, credibility, and determination to seriously challenge the official narrative surrounding the Kennedy assassination. She believed she was close to something significant. Then she was gone. Today, a street in New York carries her name. Books, documentaries, and films continue to revisit her final investigation. Yet the questions that haunted Dorothy in life continue to haunt her in death. What did Jack Ruby tell her behind that closed door? What was inside the missing file? And why were so many questions left unanswered when the answers might still have been found? History remembers Dorothy Kilgallen as a reporter who refused to stop asking difficult questions. Perhaps that is why her story still matters. Because the mystery is no longer only about who killed a president. It is also about a journalist who spent her final years searching for the truth and became part of the mystery herself. And somewhere between the official record and the evidence that vanished lies a story that America has never fully heard. A story Dorothy Kilgallen never got the chance to finish telling. Final thoughts. On a quiet corner of Manhattan, a street sign now bears the name Dorothy Kilgallen. Most people who pass it have no idea who she was. They don't know about the missing files, the private meeting with Jack Ruby, or the promise she made just days before her death that she was about to break the biggest story of her career. Perhaps the truth disappeared with her. Perhaps it still exists somewhere buried beneath decades of silence, forgotten documents, and unanswered questions. But one fact remains impossible to ignore. Dorothy Kilgallen spent her life pulling at threads powerful people preferred to leave untouched. And in the end, she became one of those threads herself. A journalist searching for the truth. A mystery that was never solved. And a story that 60 years later still refuses to let go.